Are there exercises you should be avoiding for proximal hamstring tendinopathy? In this video, we'll go over a couple different topics to help answer that question. We'll discuss some things like what stretching is, some pain science, and then obviously we'll go over some exercises as well. Let's start off by talking about the exercise you've probably been told to avoid, which is stretching the hamstrings. And there are two main reasons why this advice is given. One is that hip flexion is generally a provocative position for those with proximal hamstring tendinopathy. And then the second is compression of the tendon against the ischial tuberosity is thought to be harmful to the tendon. But this is where we need to take a look at what exactly stretching is. And if we think about it, stretching is low load loading of the tissues at the end range of motion. And if we take a look at the article on whether compressive loads were a factor in tendinopathy, they found that compressive loads alone weren't sufficient to cause structural changes to the tendon. It was compressive loads plus tensile loading. And since stretching is a low tensile load activity, then we don't necessarily need to be fearful of stretching. Of course, stretching can still be irritating to the tendon, and we might temporarily limit the amount of stretching for comfort's sake. But eventually, we actually need to expose the tendon to some of those stretched positions. And this is because when we look at something like sitting, it actually places the tendon in that stretched end range position. So incorporating some stretching actually is a way that we can expose the tendon to those end range positions to help build up the tolerance. Because if we consistently avoid those positions, then the tendon doesn't actually get better at tolerating those positions. When looking at other exercises, there aren't specific exercises that must be avoided to be able to recover from proximal hamstring tendinopathy. And that's because a lot of this has to do with load management and finding what the tendon is able to tolerate and then gradually increasing the load from there. For example, let's say that running or sprinting causes irritation to the proximal hamstring tendon. We might decrease the load on the tendon by first starting off with some walking and then progressing to some jogging and then adding in some skips. And the goal with each stage is to gradually increase the load that we're placing on the tendon to be able to tolerate running. The same approach can be applied to weightlifting. For example, with squats, we might start off with a quadruped rock and then progress to an isometric step up where we're gradually increasing the height of the step so that we're increasing the amount of hip flexion, and then gradually reintroducing squats where we're loading the hip under more hip flexion. The point here is that everybody's tendon has a different sensitivity to load, so there isn't an overarching list of movements and exercises that need to be avoided because it really depends on the individual. For some, they might be able to tolerate walking or jogging, and for others that might be provocative, so we might need to do some strengthening exercises to help build up that tolerance first. But really it's about figuring out what that person's tolerance to load is and then just gradually increasing from there. And here it's important to highlight the difference between pain and tendon damage. Frequently when we experience pain, we associate it with tissue damage, so of course we want to avoid it. But pain is actually a poor indicator of tendon health. You can think of this like pinching your skin. When you're pinching, there's pain, but as soon as you let go, there's no tissue damage and the pain stops. Similarly, a lot of times when we experience pain with an exercise or movement, it's like a pinch to the skin. There's pain with that movement or exercise, but it doesn't necessarily signal that there's tissue damage occurring to the tendon. Of course, we don't want to continually pinch the skin because that's not going to be very comfortable, but we do want to gradually build up the tolerance to that exercise or movement. In fact, when we look at some of the other rehab programs for tendons, some pain is actually tolerated, with the general guidance being that the pain should be of moderate intensity, less than a 5 out of 10, and that it shouldn't cause a flare-up after loading it. And the reason why is because we're looking at trying to build up the tolerance of the tendon to load, and we know that loading an irritated tendon might cause some short-term discomfort, but long-term it'll increase that tolerance. So hopefully this video on exercise for proximal hamstring tendinopathy provides a little bit of context. There's not a list of exercises that absolutely need to be avoided with proximal hamstring tendinopathy, but finding what the tendon is able to tolerate and then gradually build from there. And sometimes that requires decreasing the load on the tendon and then again just building up from there.